Hello, everybody. Today, I thought that I would take a look at another topic related to biblical criticism. This is kind of going to be piggybacking off of the last video I did about the historical Jesus. Today, we're going to be talking about the Q Gospel, the lost Gospel Q. Now, if you didn't watch that video where I touched on this a little bit, the Q Gospel is a theoretical source that lies behind the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So, the way the New Testament works, at least the Gospels work, is that we have four Gospels. They come in the order Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels, which is a word that means seen together because they share a lot of similarities, and the Gospel of John is completely different from them and doesn't share many of the same characteristics as the other three. So, when you're analyzing the Bible or the Gospels to get information, to try to discern information about the early Christian community or about the historical Jesus, one of the important things is to talk about what are the sources underlying the Gospels. Because sources can come from different communities that had different agendas. They can be written at different times, so there could be traditions in the Gospels that are much older than other traditions that appear in those same Gospels. So this is the kind of stuff that we need to analyze in order to know what we're talking about and be on firm historical footing when we are analyzing the Gospel stories and the life of the historical Jesus and Christianity, earliest Christianity, what it means, what it meant in its context, etc., etc. So because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar to each other, people who've analyzed the Bible for a long time have wondered why that is, why those three are so similar, whereas John is so different. And eventually, people started to posit that, well, they used each other as sources in some way. Now, this is called the synoptic problem. The relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is called the synoptic problem, and figuring out exactly what that relationship is. So the earliest kind of theory about this, I think, is sometimes called the Augustine Theory. And this is kind of held to in very traditional conservative Christian circles still. And it's that the Gospels were written in the order they appear in the Bible. Matthew was written first, and then Mark decided to make a shortened version of Matthew, and then Luke came after. For a lot of reasons, mainstream and secular historians and scholars don't believe this anymore. It's been very discredited in the eyes of most scholars. The main solution to the synoptic problem is something that we call the two-source theory, sometimes called the four-source theory, which I know is kind of confusing, but basically the two-source and the four-source theories are the same thing. And the reason for that is that the two-source theory posits that Mark was first. Mark was the first of our Gospels, of the Synoptic Gospels, to be written. And then Matthew and Luke came after, within 2 to 3 decades after Mark, independently of each other. They both used Mark as a source, and then they both used another source called Q. The reason it's called Q is because it's a German word for Quelle, which just means source. We don't have it. It doesn't actually exist. It's completely hypothetical. The reason that we hypothesize that Q existed is because in addition to Matthew and Luke having a lot of material from Mark and getting their basic narrative structure from Mark, they also contain a lot of teachings that are not found in Mark, but are found in both Matthew and Luke. So we can theorize that the material that is in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, came from another source which we nicknamed Q. Now, there is a competing hypothesis called the Ferrer hypothesis. Okay, I will be honest, there's a lot of competing hypotheses. I mean, if you go on Wikipedia, there's a whole bunch, but the only, kind of legitimate one that is, has a decent amount of people ascribing to it is called the Ferrer hypothesis. And this one holds that, again, Mark was written first. The idea that Mark was written first is called Markan priority. And, this is almost unanimous in the field when you're talking about secular and liberal and not conservative fundamentalist scholars, who I pretty much entirely discount. So almost everybody agrees that Mark came first. The Ferrer hypothesis posits that Mark came first, then Matthew, which used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew and Mark. So the main difference is that there's no Q in this theory, and Luke had access to Matthew. So Luke did know Matthew in this theory. I subscribe almost wholeheartedly to the two-source theory. This is still a majority opinion among scholars of this. I myself am almost completely convinced of the two-source theory, that is, that Mark and Q were the bases for Matthew and Luke. And we're going to get into that. We're going to do a little miniature Bible lesson in a minute to analyze a passage from the Gospels and see how you can analyze the Greek text to see how something could appear in both. Now, the reason that the two-source hypothesis hasn't fully convinced everybody is because there are two major objections to it. As we're about to see, both of these objections, in my opinion, are not very strong, but these are the two objections. And the first one is that for Q to have existed, it would have had to have been a sayings gospel, not a narrative gospel like Mark, Matthew, and Luke. A narrative gospel contains basically a full narrative and contains actual narrative stories of characters doing things, Jesus and his disciples and Pontius Pilate, etc. Whereas a saying gospel is kind of just a collection of Jesus' sayings without a lot of narrative context. Now, when Q started to first be hypothesized in the 19th century, and then it was kind of codified by a historian and scholar named Burnett Hillman Streeter in the early 1920s. This was a bit of a stronger objection because we didn't have a lot of evidence of these so-called sayings gospels. So we were not only theorizing a hypothetical gospel, but we were theorizing a hypothetical type of gospel that we did not have a lot of evidence for that directly existed. Now, this objection has lost a lot of its weight because in the 1950s, we discovered a full copy of the Gospel of Thomas, which was something that we knew existed because it was mentioned in early writings, and we had a few scraps of it in Greek, but they found a full Coptic text of it in Nag Hammadi in 1954, I want to say. Don't flame me if I got the year wrong. But so now we have kind of definitive proof that sayings gospels were a thing in the first century. A lot of historians can date the earliest layers of the Gospel of Thomas to the first century before Matthew, Mark, and Luke were even written. So we do have evidence that sayings gospels were a thing. So that objection doesn't quite hold as much water as it used to anymore. And then the second objection is what we call the minor agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark. So these are situations where a passage appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So under the two-source theory, it would generally be assumed to be originally in Mark and then copied from Mark into Matthew and Luke. But in several cases, Matthew and Luke have the same wording as each other, and Mark has a different wording. That's why they're called agreements against Mark. So Matthew and Luke will have a phrase written one way, and Mark will have it a different way. So the objection is that if Luke did not know Matthew and was only using Mark and Q, then it doesn't make sense that he would agree with Matthew's wording against Mark's. And again, these are not passages from Q, these are things that do appear in Mark. So if Luke and Matthew have the same wording as each other, it makes more sense, so the argument goes, that Luke knew Matthew and was copying directly from Matthew. Now, B.H. Streeter, the guy I just mentioned, actually wrote a lot refuting this idea, and I just want to go over it a little bit because I think it's important to talk about and helps give you a sense of why I still support the two-source theory. Streeter talks about how all of these so-called minor agreements can fall under 4 different categories. The first category is irrelevant, which is like very, very minor agreements to the point of like very minor words like articles like the or and he says that they are a result of Matthew and Luke revising throughout in the direction of the literary idiom. And now this is because Mark, we know, was not a native Greek speaker. His Greek was very bad. So, the author of Mark, I mean. So, Matthew and Luke, who were both much better at writing Greek, would have naturally cleaned up the language of Mark because it was so rough in similar ways. The second category that these agreements could fall under is deceptive, which Streeter describes as, at first sight, they're too striking to be attributed to coincidence, but they are shown on closer inspection to be alterations which would naturally occur to independent editors. He has a lot of examples. This video would be 3 hours long if I read his whole essay about that, so I'm not going to do that, but I will try to post a link to the essay in the description if anybody's interested, because he has a lot of examples. The third category is textual corruption. Now, we don't have original copies of any of the Gospels. The copies we have to look at were written hundreds of years later because they were preserved for hundreds of years by various scribes. A lot of copies got lost, so we don't have original copies. We have copies of copies of copies. And in the course of making so many copies over hundreds of years, naturally, there's going to be some mistakes. So this idea is that later editors have revised the texts either consciously or subconsciously to agree with each other. So someone copying Luke was influenced by remembering how Matthew worded something, or vice versa. Or somebody copying the Gospels could have made a mistake in Mark. So there would be a case where Matthew and Luke would have preserved the original wording of Mark correctly, but then Mark got corrupted in some sense by a copyist. Some medieval monk copying Mark would have made a mistake. So Matthew and Luke would actually have Mark's original wording, but it would appear that they agreed against Mark because Mark has been corrupted. These kinds of things are extremely possible, and again, Streeter has examples of them in his essay. The fourth category, it's actually the third category in his essay, but I'm putting it here as fourth because it's going to lead into what I want to spend the rest of the time in this video doing. The fourth category concerns the influence of Q on passages in Matthew and Luke. Now, this may seem a little confusing at first because we're talking about passages that are in Matthew, Luke, and Mark. So what would Q have anything to do with it? And this is where I think evidence for Q's existence is strongest, because if you analyze the text, you can see clear examples of a passage that occurred in Mark and separately in Q. So it's not just passages that don't appear in Mark but do in Matthew and Luke. There are examples of sayings or teachings that appear in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, but through analyzing the text, we can infer that they appeared in Q as well. So if there are any instances where we can determine that there is a passage or a saying or a pericope that occurs in Q and Mark, if there's evidence of that, then it's possible that the Q wording of that saying influenced the way Matthew and Luke copied it from Mark. So Q might have used a slightly different word than Mark did, and after copying it from Q, Matthew and Luke could have read the same or similar passage in Mark, but with slightly different wording, and remembered the way Q had worded it, and then so used Q's wording because it came more natural to them. Again, because Mark was not written in very good Greek. So what I want to do is take a look at one of these passages that occurs in both Mark and Q, and just go over some of the Greek so you can see kind of how we do this, how we can look at these and determine that it came from two separate sources. And the passage I want to look at is a pericope that I go over in my book, The Carpenter's Son, and I think it's actually, it's my favorite passage in all of the Gospels, probably, at least one of them, and I do think it is the most important passage in the Gospels for understanding the historical Jesus and his mission and what it means to be a Christian. Now, this is a passage I call the mission, and I got that from John Dominic Crossan. He calls it like mission and meal, or he has mission in there, but he has another name for it too. I just prefer to call it the mission. And this saying can be found in Mark chapter 6, verses 6 through 13, Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, and then skip to verse 5 through 15. And then it's in Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, and Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. Now, here is where things get tricky. You might have noticed that this saying appears once in Mark, once in Matthew, and twice in Luke. The reason for that is that it appeared in Mark originally, in Mark chapter 6, and then it also appeared in Q. So what happened was Luke took Mark's version and put it in his chapter 9, and then he took Q's version and put it in his chapter 10. What Matthew did was take Mark's and Q's versions and combine them into one longer version. And if you look at the Greek, you can see exactly how he did it. It's very striking. First, I'm going to read the Q version. This is from Luke 10, verses 1 through 12. After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say peace to this house. And if anyone is there who shares in peace, your peace will rest on that person, but if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Wherever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you, cure the sick who are there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out into its streets and say, even the dust of your town that clings to our feet we wipe off in protest against you. Yet know this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, on that day it will be more tolerable for Sodom than for that town." Now, just to get into a quick aside so you kind of know what I meant when I said that this was the most important passage. This passage is one of the best attested passages in the entire Synoptic Gospel canon of sayings. So that version is the Q version found in Luke chapter 10, verses 1 through 12, the New Revised Standard Version. There are elements from this passage, this idea of Jesus sending his followers out to do not move from house to house, to cure the sick, proclaim the kingdom of God, eat what is set before you, the laborer deserves to be paid, etc., etc. You can find elements of this idea in Mark and Q, which is what we're talking about now. You can also find isolated examples in Paul in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the laborer deserving to his wages in regards to, and traveling with a believing wife, a sister wife is the literal translation. It's like adelphos gineka or something is the Greek. It means sister wife. So this, as John Dominic Crossan has shown in his book, The Historical Jesus, and I'll link to that, he talks about how this probably referred to the same practice of prophets traveling two by two. So you can see elements of it in Paul. You can see elements of it in the Didache, which is a manual of Christian practice from the first century that did not make it into the Bible, but it also talks about traveling prophets and how you're supposed to house them. Christians are supposed to house the traveling Christian prophets by feeding them. And then you can also see there are examples in the Gospel of Thomas. They're kind of scattered around. The part about eat what they set before you and heal the sick is in Thomas verse 14, saying 14, which is the only time that Thomas mentions healing. And then Thomas 73 also has the bit about the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Beseech the Lord to send out laborers to the harvest, which is specifically from the Q version. So you have all of these different sources from early Christianity, Thomas, Q, Mark, Paul, the Didache, and they all are talking about this idea. So basically, I go into this more in my book, The Carpenter's Son, if anyone is interested. But the idea is that this is kind of the mission statement of Jesus' movement, of the earliest Christians when Jesus was still alive. It was a movement of sending prophets out to proclaim the kingdom of God, heal the sick, eat with people, and as I argue in my book, it functioned as a form of prefigurative dual power, which was to signal and begin to create the communist kingdom of God, a place of absolute equality and abundance on earth. So, just a little theological, historical aside here, but that's why this passage is so important, and it also happens to be one of the best examples of how to analyze the Q source that is in the Gospels. So it's a great thing that we are able to talk about it. So first, I want to look at some characteristics of Mark's version of this saying, and again, this is found in Mark chapter 6. So I'm going to be just kind of going, we're going to focus on Greek vocabulary. I'm not fluent in Koine Greek. I'm learning it. And I just want to say this as a disclaimer because I know somebody who went to seminary is going to hop in the comments to tell me I'm pronouncing things wrong. No, I'm not. I'm pronouncing things in modern Greek. This is not the way it's taught in seminary. I did not go to seminary. I speak a little Greek and I know how to pronounce things in modern Greek. So that's what I am using, and you can cry about it. Yeah. The way that they teach people to pronounce Greek in seminary is like a reconstructed pronunciation. It's like the way that they think maybe it was pronounced at the time, but there's no real evidence. I think it should be done away with, and people should just pronounce it in modern Greek because it's way easier. Okay, so Mark's version of the saying has a few key vocabulary words, and these emphasize kind of what this whole mission of the 12 is about. So I'm going to read the phrases, and I'll put them up on the screen. So it's Erxato aftus apostelin. He sent them forth. Now, the key word here is apostolin. It's where we get the word apostle from. It's he sent them forth, or it's basically sent forth. And then a verse later, it's kai paringilin aftois. He instructed them. So it's he sent them forth, he instructed them, and then finally you get this weird version of a verb, ekyrixan is how you say it. They preached or they proclaimed. So these are the key words in Mark's version. He sent them forth, apostolin, he instructed them, which is paringilin, and then they proclaimed or preached, which is ekyrixan. Okay. So if you go then to Matthew's version, you can see that Matthew uses variations on the same key vocabulary words. This is Matthew's version in 10, and these are all put right together in Matthew chapter 10, verse 5. So he says, Tous dodeka apestilen, o Jesus, Jesus sent forth the 12. Then you get this one again, parangelas aftois, having instructed them. And then you get the more common version of that strange verb that Mark used to proclaim or to preach, kirisete. So Matthew has it as kirisete. Mark has a weird version that is ekyrixan. Like I said, Mark was not good at Greek. Because if you go down to Luke's version next, and this is Luke's version in chapter 9, this is where Luke copied Mark. Luke also has apestilen, which is the where we get apostle from. It's he sent them. An apostle is one who is sent. Apestilen aftus kirisen, to proclaim. So Matthew and Luke both have the kirisen or kirisete. Mark has the weird ekyrixan, but it is the same verb. It's a non-standard kind of weird version of the verb. So Luke lacks the verb for instructed, paringilin, but he does use that same verb a few verses later. But so basically you see this sequence of verbs appears in all of the Markan versions of this. None of these appear in Luke chapter 10, which is the Q version. Now, Luke chapter 10 has some Greek verbs and words, vocabulary words that don't appear in the Markan version or in Luke 9. So the Q version found in Luke chapter 10 and then scattered throughout Matthew chapter 10. One of the best examples is sandal. So the Q version and this is found in Luke chapter 10 and also in Matthew. So it occurs in Matthew 10:10 and Luke 10:4. The word for sandal they use is ipodima. Ipodima is a sandal. So that's in Matthew 10:10 and Luke 10:4. But it doesn't appear in Mark or Luke 9. The interesting thing is if you read them in English, you'll see sandal there in Mark 6 and Luke 9. But the Greek word is different. Mark and Luke 9, so Mark 6 and then Luke 9, the Markan version uses the word sandalia for sandal. So sandalia is in the Mark version, but the Q version uses ipodima. These are two different words for sandals, and you can see that each version of this saying used them differently. Now this is because these sayings of Jesus were originally in Aramaic and then had to be translated to Greek. So they were just translated with two different words. Another example is the phrase, the kingdom of God has come near. That version of come near is the Greek word engiken, and this appears only in Matthew 10:7 and Luke 10:9. It doesn't appear in Mark 6 or in Luke 9. So you can see again that that's something that comes from the Q version, and then Matthew laced it into his combination, and Luke only used it where he put the Q version. So Mark speaks of them proclaiming the kingdom of God with the verb kirisete, and then the Q version speaks of the kingdom of God coming near, engiken. It's two different kind of ways of saying the same idea, but they come in two different versions. Another good one is the saying about the laborers are few, but the harvest is plentiful. That, again, only appears in Luke 10 and Matthew 10, actually kind of right when he's finished. He puts it at the end of this discourse. Luke has it nearer to the beginning. But this is another one that comes from the Q version. Matthew rearranged everything in the Q version, so that's why he moves it towards the end to kind of lead into another diatribe that he's doing. Luke has it where it probably was in the Q version. So there are a lot of examples like this if you analyze these passages in the Greek, which, to be fair, is kind of difficult to do because you have to have all of these passages in front of you, 4 different Greek passages and all that. So I understand that it's hard. I was sitting here flipping through my interlinear New Testament for hours putting this all together. But for people who want to learn about Q, I think this is a great example of how you can read the Greek text to see how these different sources found their ways into the Gospels as we have them today. And this is why, along with the kind of weakness of the objections to the two-source theory, looking at the Greek is really where I see evidence of Q. I don't see any way for Luke to have gotten the passage in Luke chapter 10, verse 1 through 6. I don't see how he could have gotten that from just reading Matthew and Mark. There's just no real way that makes sense. It's very obvious that what happened was Matthew took the Mark version in Mark chapter 6 and the Q version, which we can find in Luke chapter 10, and he combined them together. There's a lot of, if you just go and look at them, even in English, you can see examples. And then when you read it in Greek, as I've tried to show here, you can see even more very obvious examples of that happening. So yeah, I hope that this was a helpful introduction for anybody who is interested in learning more about New Testament criticism or about the historical Jesus and how we know these things. Please sound off in the comments if I explain something badly, if I need to elaborate on anything, or if you just want to tell me anything at all about this channel. Sorry it's been so long between videos again. I'm going to probably end up saying that every time, but I hope that this was a good informational one, and I promise we will get to more communist revolutionary content soon. Thank you.